Hey, what's going on, guys? In this video, we'll finally be completing the main trio from the original Gundam anime series. This is the Master Grade RX-75 Guntank. This is one of those kits that I've been trying to track down for years. I'm a huge fan of the Gundam version 2.0 and was surprised by how much I enjoyed the Master Grade Guncannon. So naturally, I'm really excited to see how this Guntank holds up. We'll be going through this Master Grade model kit in the usual 4 categories, giving each a score from 1 to 5. Then at the end we can tally it all up for an average score. I've also included timestamps in the description, in case you'd like to jump to a specific section. Alright, now let's dive right in. With such a unique design, you'd think the build for this Guntank would be really crazy. However, I found the majority of this kit to be surprisingly straightforward. Outside of the treads, which we'll get to shortly, everything from the waist up was pretty simple stuff. The chest, for example, doesn't have much in the way of inner frame, instead having a core fighter inside. You're really just snapping together the surrounding armor. There's a bit more going on with the upper chest, but most of it is just large pieces snapped over top of each other. Then you get to the shoulders, where they look to have the same rotating domes as seen in the Guncannon. However, they're basically just your standard Master Grade shoulders inside some round armor pieces. Working our way down the arm though, things do get a bit more interesting. In the elbow, we get this pull-out feature that allows for some improved articulation. We also get a spinning gimmick from the fingers. This is achieved through some really simple engineering that pushes each finger down as you rotate this forearm section. It's basic stuff, but cool nonetheless. Moving to this tank section below, I was expecting some intricate inner frame here, as there's ample room for one, but it's also a fairly simple snap build. Outside of a tilting gimmick for the waist and an openable hatch, this is just a series of large pieces snapped together. Really, it seems like all the complex engineering in this build was saved for the tank treads. They separate off from the main section, so you can build each independently. And man, are they a build. They're actually semi-functional, having independent shocks and wheels. It was really interesting putting together all these moving pieces. There's also a switch under this hatch that allows for the wheels to pop out. It's so satisfying to mess with. Then of course we have the treads themselves. Each of these treads is an individual plastic piece. Yeah, each side is made up of 38 separate pieces that you snap together. The finished result looks amazing, and since these are plastic pieces, you could really go crazy with a custom paint job or weathering. I will say though, these aren't the most interesting sections to put together. Once you get past the uniqueness of it, you realize you're basically just cutting out the same small piece and removing the same 2 nubs at least 76 times. Stack on having to cut out the same wheel 10 times and the same shocks 10 times, and this is definitely a build you're going to want to take breaks with. Regardless, there's a lot of interesting engineering in these treads that you're not going to find on other kits, and it really makes this Guntank stand out compared to the hundreds of more standard Gundam builds. Moving on to the painting, there really isn't a whole lot to do here. As far as I can tell, everything here comes in its anime-accurate color, with the only mandatory painting being on this head. This section on the top comes in clear, as seen in the snap build, but it really should be a nice cyan or a light blue. There's no sticker here, so paint is required to fix this up. Of course, since this is a clear piece, it does mean you could paint this top section any color you want, which I'm sure will be great for some custom paint jobs. Outside of that, I really can't find many places that require paint. I did notice these little hidden pistons under these flaps on the chest. They aren't real pistons, instead being molded into this piece, but adding some silver to them is a nice improvement. Same goes for the inner frame found inside the chest fins, where I added some black paint. Other than that, there are some moving pieces found inside the joints for the treads, but I didn't bother painting them, as they're almost always hidden behind these large treads anyways. The treads themselves, though, have a ton of potential for detailing. All these separate pieces are just asking for a few coats of gunmetal, and I bet if you alternate your shading, you can make each of these pieces stand out. I could see someone spending hours detailing up these treads, and making each shock and wheel look amazing. The sky is really the limit here. This build was a weird mix of simple and unique. From the waist up, it can be a little more bland than you'd expect, but then you get to these treads, and you see all the individual pieces come together. I do highly recommend taking breaks though. Still, I did enjoy this build, so let's give this build an above average 4 out of 5. Now that we've got this guy built, let's see how he turned out. With this Guntank coming out close to the Gundam version 2.0, it of course shares many of its design cues, mainly a focus on anime accuracy. It has very blocky proportions, fitting of the very off-model takes you'd see in the original anime, but they've been slightly refined here. Nothing looks too out of place or wonky on this kit. I honestly really like this silhouette. I also really like the colors on this kit. They look to be very accurate to the original show. This blue seems to be a little more saturated or darker than on screen, but I don't think it's too noticeable on its own. The yellow also has that slight tinge of orange that I like so much, and this duller red does a great job of blending these colors together. I'd say these colors are about as close to the original show as you can get. Despite this anime accuracy though, you will notice a few additional panel lines on this suit. Above the waist, it's just a few tick marks here and there, very in line with the Gundam version 2.0. But this tank section below is covered in additional lines. It's a little more than I'd like, but they do a pretty good job of spicing up these large pieces of plastic. For the most part, this darker blue blends everything together very well. I will make a note though, a lot of these are pretty shallow. My ink is already starting to fade up on most of these. I'm thinking paint would probably work better here. You get 2 sheets of decals with this kit, one dry transfer and the other peel and stick. While I only use 2 or 3 of these, you get a pretty decent selection that I'm sure someone looking for a more realistic build would really appreciate. I will say though, I'm a huge fan of these unique strips that go over the cannons. It's like they just rolled off their production line and still have the red tape on them. It's such a cool addition. The appearance here is phenomenal. The colors and proportions are both solid, and the panel lines aren't too overbearing. Honestly, I can't find many flaws with his appearance, and what I can find are probably just personal preference. So let's give this appearance a perfect 5 out of 5. While this kit looks great, I can't help but be more interested in what articulation you can get out of this literal tank. Unlike most of my reviews, let's start at the top with this head. It's a pretty decent ball joint on top of a backward swivel. You get an alright amount of backwards movement, but not much else. You're even limited with its spins, given the armor around the cannons. The cannons themselves have some basic movement, being a hinge on a swivel. You get some basic twist, and they can lower up and down. The barrels themselves have a spring inside that can help mimic a recoil effect. This spring is made out of plastic though, so it's kind of tough to push in and out. I don't think it's going to be useful for too much, but it's still a nice feature. If you're going for cannon poses though, you can flip up these flaps in the chest to help support the barrels. They add a ton of weight to the cannons and really amp up his action poses. Just make sure to hit up this piston inside with a little bit of silver. Onto these shoulders, despite the rounded shape, they're actually just your standard master grade shoulders. You get the usual lateral movement and 360-degree spins. Working our way down the arm, we get another spin and a pretty pathetic 45-degree bend. Thankfully, like mentioned in the build, you can pop this elbow out for a much improved 90-degree bend. Considering how blocky these arms are, it does its job. Lastly, on the arms, we have his rotating finger guns. It's a pretty simple effect, basically being a disc pushing down on each finger in sequence, but it's still satisfying to mess with. Definitely a standout feature on this kit, and it adds a lot of personality to his poses. Honestly though, these arms in general are pretty poor. You'll notice there's no pop out from the shoulder, which feels like a real missed opportunity. I mean, he doesn't have legs, so the arms are really doing most of the work conveying an action pose. Given how important these arms are, you'd think we would have gotten a lot more options here. Onto the chest, despite having a core block inside, you get some alright movement from the surrounding armor. It's just some very slight tilts, but still nice. You can add a bit more character here by opening these vents on the chest, though I would recommend adding some black paint in here just to get them looking good. Further below, we get a great tilt that moves the entire upper part of this kit forwards and backwards. This is extremely useful for when you want to get a more aggressive pose. Onto the tank section, we naturally don't get a lot here. There are some nice additions though, like this stabilizer on the front. It just slides out, and I suppose you could use it for like a locked-in cannon pose. Same goes for this flap on the back, which you can unfold to reveal some additional vents. However, it's the connection to these treads that's really interesting. There's quite a few moving pieces in here, even having one of the few sliding pistons found on this kit. All of these pieces come together to allow the treads to basically separate from the body. You can tilt them outwards for a shooting pose, or maybe to one side for like a turning shot. You can even get a full 360-degree swivel here if you wanted. This is all around a great connection. As if that wasn't enough, there's also a lowering feature. You can flip down the entire joint, which brings the whole tread section downwards. This lets him get footing on just about any surface. I will make a note though, that if you're too rough with this joint, some of the internal pieces like this ball joint can disconnect. It happened quite a few times for me, and it's a real hassle to fix given how recessed some of these pieces are. You're definitely going to want to go slow when you move these treads. Like mentioned in the build, each of these wheels can rotate freely, and they're also on a separate shock that pushes inwards. There's also this hidden switch that pushes out the wheels and tightens up the treads. It's a really cool effect, and helps show off just how many individual pieces are in here. Onto the treads themselves, they snap into each other using a hinge, allowing you to contort them however you'd like. As cool as this is though, the connection for each joint is very weak. I'll often have the linkages disconnect when moving the wheels, and it can be a real pain to reattach. I've also had a few pieces straight up break on me. Thankfully, you do get 4 extra pieces just in case, but still, these can be very annoying. So while it's tempting to play around with these semi-functional tank treads, they're definitely more for show than anything. This articulation has a surprising amount of movement, but it's still ultimately a tank. Still, this Guntank can actually score some really dynamic shots. Of course, it really is just 3 or 4 unique poses, but what else could you really ask for from a Guntank? So let's give this articulation a respectable 4 out of 5. Alright, it's time to see what gimmicks or extras this guy comes with. As for the gimmicks, well, I don't think Bandai really had much to work with here, as the Guntank doesn't have the largest arsenal. You don't get any additional weapons or interchangeable parts here. Still, there are a few extras, like these small pilot statues. You get a decent selection here, all of characters from the original anime. You also get the standard core fighter. It's the exact same build as the Gundam version 2.0 and 3.0, so nothing new, but still a nice inclusion. However, since there's no dedicated core block, you're probably going to have it inside the chest most of the time. You can remove it and sort of lock the body in place, but it can look pretty awkward in certain action shots. A real interesting addition with this kit is the inclusion of Bandai's LED unit. It's the usual green insert that requires 2 coin cell batteries to run. Putting it inside the head is easy, as it just pops in from underneath. This head connection isn't very strong either, so it's no problem taking it off and on. Like all LED inserts, your mileage will vary depending on how bright your room is. But generally, I found this to be a little weak. It only really shines through 2 slots on the front of the head. They're not the most prominent though. In fact, I've had them on this entire video and I'm willing to bet most people didn't notice. You really need a dark room for these to shine. Having said that, if you look close enough, this LED does light up the control panel inside the cockpit. This is a really cool effect, and a great way to use this more open cockpit design. And that about does it for the gimmicks. You don't really get a whole lot, and you can tell Bandai realized that and decided to just throw in an LED unit to compensate. I really would have liked to have seen some interchangeable cannons, like on the Guncannon, or maybe a dedicated core block for the chest, or maybe some effect pieces. Just something, you know? So let's give these gimmicks just an average score of 3 out of 5. And with that, let's wrap all this up. Here are the scores for the build, appearance, articulation, and gimmicks. Tallying all that up and dividing, this Master Grade Guntank receives a 4 out of 5. In terms of a percentage, it receives an 80%. That sounds about right for this kit. This was everything you'd expect from a Master Grade Guntank, but there were some areas I wanted more from. The build was fairly straightforward for the most part. Honestly kinda boring in some places. However, these tank treads are really interesting, with lots of unique pieces that you're not going to find in other kits. Though you'll probably want to take breaks when cutting them out. The appearance is about as accurate as you can get to the original show. It has great proportions and colors. I also found the additional panel lines did a good job of spicing up some of the blockier sections. I would have liked to have seen a bit more from the articulation, specifically in the arms and shoulders, but he can still hit your standard poses. You do get a lot out of these treads though, and they're really fun to mess with, at least until one of these treads snap off. Lastly, for the gimmicks, I don't really blame Bandai for keeping it sparse. What you do get though is pretty good. I really like the inclusion of this LED, even if it doesn't do a whole lot. All in all, this kit is above average for sure, but I also don't think you'd be missing much by skipping over it. For fans of the original anime though, specifically those that want to complete the original trio, this kit is a great buy, and it definitely stands out on your shelf compared to the dozens of standard Gundams. This kit is exactly what you'd expect from a master grade gun tank, and if you're the kind of person that's looking for that, you'll have a great time with it. And that about does it. Feel free to give this video a like or subscribe to the channel for more reviews. You can also follow me on Instagram and X. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.